A millionaire brought his maid to a business dinner, but what she did upon arrival left everyone stunned. Grace had been working at Daniel Carter's mansion for almost 3 years. She took pride in her job, but never once expected he'd pull her aside for such an odd and unexpected request. Daniel, a prominent and rather distant businessman, was in a tight spot with his company and needed to impress a few influential investors at a dinner that evening. Running out of options and patience to find a proper guest, he glanced at Grace, who was dusting the shelves in his office, and said in a commanding tone, "I need you to join me at an important dinner tonight. This isn't an invitation. It's a directive. Show up and be discreet. I need someone who won't draw attention or have opinions of their own." Grace was taken aback, but hid her reaction. His request felt more like a direct order. Yet she sensed this might be her chance to prove herself in some way. She agreed, feeling a mix of tension and anticipation. This wouldn't be just any evening. Arriving at the restaurant on time, dressed elegantly, Grace saw Daniel waiting at the door, looking restless. He barely acknowledged her, grumbling, "Let's go," as if she were nothing more than a necessary add-on. As they walked into the upscale restaurant, Grace could feel all eyes on them. The investors, gathered around a central table, took note. Daniel introduced her in a clipped tone, not even bothering with her last name. "This is Grace. She's with me tonight," he stated, quickly looking away. The investors, all in sharp suits and with appraising looks, gave polite smiles, though some exchanged subtle glances of surprise. It was clear they didn't expect someone like Grace at the table, and their silent judgments were obvious. Grace noticed every look, but held her composure. Through the meal, she listened quietly while Daniel and the investors discussed finances, expansion strategies, and projections. Grace stayed silent, observing closely and soaking up every detail. At one moment, one of the investors, Mr. Butler, a tall man with a commanding presence, turned to her with a faintly mocking smile. "So, Grace, how does it feel to attend a business dinner like this?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected her to be overwhelmed. Grace sensed the tension around the table. She could have just given a polite, meaningless reply, but instead she chose to stand her ground. "Actually, it's pretty eye-opening to see how everything works firsthand," she replied calmly. "The focus on financial details and projections is important, but I think it's just as crucial to understand the people driving those numbers." The room fell silent. Grace stayed composed, while Daniel's expression showed a blend of surprise and frustration. She had just demonstrated she had a voice, something he had instructed her to suppress. Mr. Butler, caught off guard by her boldness, let out a brief, amused chuckle. "An interesting perspective," he said, while the other investors looked at her with a newfound interest. Daniel's expression tensed, as he became obviously annoyed by the attention Grace was starting to get. The evening was turning out to be anything but low-key, completely contrary to his plans. Yet Grace seemed to be discovering her own voice in a setting that, until then, hadn't seemed welcoming. As dinner continued, she held her ground, even as Daniel grew more unsettled. She was at the table, and he avoided looking at her directly. But Mr. Butler only seemed more drawn to involving Grace in the discussion, perhaps because she was the only one defying expectations in this setting. When the conversation shifted to social responsibility, a topic that seemed to make Daniel even more uncomfortable, Grace saw a chance to speak up. "Has Mr. Carter given thought to social initiatives within his company?" Mr. Butler asked, glancing slyly at Daniel. Daniel hesitated, looking uneasy. Before he could offer a vague reply, Grace, keeping her composure, responded directly. "I believe social initiatives are a way for a company to give back to the community that supported its growth. After all, there's more to business than just profit. It would be a meaningful move. Silence settled over the room, with every gaze fixed on Grace. Rather than retreating, she kept a calm and composed expression, standing firm on her principles. To her, this was about staying true to herself. Mr. Butler, clearly impressed, offered a smile. "Exactly my thoughts, Grace. You don't hear that kind of honesty around here often," he commented, intentionally challenging Daniel. Daniel's face tightened. He had brought Grace to this dinner, expecting her to blend into the background, but now she was drawing attention he hadn't anticipated. Irritated, he decided to steer the evening in a different direction. "It's easy to have opinions when you're not the one making tough leadership decisions." "Grace," he said, with a slight dismissive smirk, "don't you think you're speaking on something beyond your experience?" Grace met Daniel's gaze, recognizing the challenge in his tone. Yet she stood her ground. "Maybe I don't bear the weight of leadership decisions, but I understand their impact. Sometimes those who aren't at the top have a clearer view of what's happening below." Her response was bold and caught everyone off guard. Her confidence made Mr. Butler chuckle, and the other investors exchanged admiring looks. Grace's poise had quickly shifted the atmosphere of the evening, leaving Daniel in stunned silence as he struggled to regain control. Though he masked his discomfort, it was clear he felt undermined. To Daniel, this was a betrayal. When the dinner wrapped up, he didn't wait for Grace, walking out ahead and leaving her on her own. But Grace didn't mind. She knew she'd stayed true to herself, and her voice had been heard. That was what mattered. Yet she had no idea that Daniel wouldn't let the events of that night slide. Back at the mansion, Daniel's frustration was barely contained. The moment Grace entered, he summoned her to his office, forgoing any pleasantries. His eyes were dark with anger. "What were you thinking, Grace?" he snapped, hardly waiting for her to sit. "I invited you to support me quietly, not to steal the spotlight." Grace, still composed despite the intensity of the evening, kept her calm. She knew this conversation wouldn't go well, yet she stood by her actions. "All I did was answer a question, Mr. Daniel. I simply shared my opinion," she said, her voice steady. "Opinion?" He shot her a scornful look. "You're a housekeeper, Grace. You're not paid to have an opinion at a business dinner." You crossed the line, overstepped completely. She held her breath, feeling the sting of his words. Daniel couldn't grasp her drive or her desire to prove she could offer more than her assigned role. To him, she'd always be just the housekeeper. "If my presence bothered you so much, why bring me along?" Grace asked, her voice steady but unyielding. "Don't start with that. You were there to work and stay quiet. That's part of your paycheck," Daniel replied, his tone icy and final. "Consider this your last day. You're fired." His words hit like a final blow, but Grace kept her composure, refusing to show how much it hurt. She simply nodded, preserving her pride, stood up, and walked away. Leaving the mansion, she felt relief knowing she'd never again endure Daniel's disdain. That night, Grace found clarity about her own worth and potential. Though abrupt, this firing felt like a doorway to something new. The next morning, while she packed her things, an unexpected call came. It was Mr. Butler, an investor who had noticed her courage at the dinner. He wanted her on his team, an offer she never dreamed of receiving. Surprised and excited, Grace accepted without hesitation. What felt like Daniel's attempt to humiliate her had turned into the opportunity of a lifetime. Over the next few months, Grace thrived in her new role. Under Mr. Butler's mentorship, she unlocked talents she'd never had the chance to develop in her previous job. Her dedication and leadership quickly earned her the respect of her peers, and she became a valued member of the company. Finally, she was in an environment where her voice mattered. Here's a little game for those who read the comments. Type hamburger if you've made it this far. Now, back to the story. Meanwhile, Daniel's situation was about to take a turn for the worse. The trouble at his company was deepening. Rash moves, made purely for short-term gain, were taking a heavy toll. Daniel's pride had cost him key contracts and driven off valuable partners. Things took a sharp turn when the firm where Grace now worked bought a significant share of Daniel's business, placing her in a high-ranking role directly connected to his operations. They crossed paths again at a big corporate gathering. Daniel stepped into the room, his face draining of color, when he spotted Grace seated confidently among the top brass. He paused, staring at her, as if grappling with the idea that his former housekeeper was now part of the leadership circle. Grace met his look, unwavering but calm, with no trace of bitterness. Her focus was on her new role and the impact she could make. This was only the beginning of the tension. After the meeting, Daniel approached her, his expression hard and brimming with disbelief and irritation. "Grace," he muttered, trying to keep his composure. "So you're with them now?" Grace didn't flinch, keeping her cool despite his reaction. "Yes, as you can see, we acquired a substantial part of your company." Daniel laughed derisively, trying to cover his discomfort. "This is absurd. You think having a title here means you understand real leadership?" Grace's tone remained steady. "Daniel, working for you taught me exactly what not to do to lead a team and how to ignore the kind of arrogance that blinds people. Quite the lesson." He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, but she didn't budge. "Don't think this changes anything between us. You're still just a lucky housekeeper," he sneered. Grace folded her arms, holding his gaze, her voice strong. "That's where you're wrong, Daniel. I don't need your respect. I earned my place. Luck had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, you're watching your empire crumble because you've never valued anything beyond yourself." Daniel was momentarily speechless, the exchange laying bare the weaknesses he'd long ignored. Someone he had previously dismissed as unimportant caused him to... He saw clearly the self-destructive path he was on, and it stung. Grace was no longer just a rival. She was the reflection he dreaded, exposing his weaknesses without hesitation. Her words replayed in his mind, a truth he wished he hadn't been forced to confront. After their encounter, he could no longer ignore the reckless decisions that had led him toward financial disaster. Daniel felt the weight of his own ego, the same arrogance that had driven away loyal employees, reliable partners, and even his family. That evening, instead of immersing himself in desperate schemes to salvage what remained, he found himself reflecting on every impulsive decision he'd made. Days later, Daniel and Grace were summoned to an investor meeting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The fate of his company rested on the outcome of this gathering. Daniel, nervous and drained, walked in trying to project confidence. Grace was already there, composed, flipping through documents. Once seated, the lead investor addressed Daniel bluntly. "Your company's current state is dire, Daniel. A drastic change is needed, and soon. Understand, this is your last opportunity to persuade the board you're fit to lead and turn this around." A lump formed in Daniel's throat, but he worked to hold his composure. He presented new strategies and ideas, attempting to assert control. Yet it was clear his approach was still shallow, fixated solely on short-term gains. The investors shared skeptical glances, recognizing the same short-sightedness that had brought him to this point. Then Grace spoke, catching everyone off guard with her insight. "This company needs a new focus," she said. "We can't just chase profits anymore. We have to reconnect with the people, which means real dedication to social responsibility and valuing our employees. The investors looked at one another, visibly intrigued, as the board leaders nodded for Grace to continue. Grace spoke with confidence, laying out the benefits of blending social initiatives with a more people-centered approach to the business, which would not only create a lasting positive impact, but also secure a sustainable future. Sitting beside her, Daniel felt a wave of helplessness. He could see not just the self-assurance behind Grace's every word, but also the respect she was earning from the investors. The reality was undeniable. He was losing his grip on the company he once controlled, and Grace was stepping up to save it. When the meeting concluded, it was clear the investors felt more assured about Grace's proposed direction. As they exited, Daniel paused in the hallway. Grace noticed and turned back to him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "Why would you help me save this company?" Grace met his gaze, taking a steady breath before responding. "Because, unlike you, I believe in people, Daniel. And even more, I believe this company has a future, whether you're in it or not." Her words struck him like a cold shock, leaving him silent as their meaning sank in. For the first time, Daniel felt something beyond his usual pride and independence. He felt a genuine need to change, to become a better person. Grace gave him a brief look before she walked away. Watching her go, Daniel realized that this woman, whom he had once overlooked, had now become his strongest influence. He couldn't shake her words from his mind. He understood he'd made plenty of mistakes, but it felt as if Grace was silently judging him with each step. While he yearned to prove he could improve, he also saw Grace as a reminder of everything he hadn't achieved. The tension between them grew thicker each day. Grace's polished professionalism and insightful comments often cut through his intentions before he could voice them, and this unnerved him. That week, a critical meeting was scheduled with the board of investors. With the company's finances hanging by a thread, Daniel knew a single misstep could mean disaster. He was determined to show strong leadership and, just maybe, demonstrate to Grace that he still had something valuable to offer. On the day of the meeting, Grace arrived early, meticulously preparing the presentation. Daniel, meanwhile, had crafted a separate speech, something he planned to introduce mid-meeting as a bold move. He was convinced this approach would be enough to impress the board and prove his commitment. As the meeting commenced, Grace laid out her plan to secure steady growth while safeguarding resources. Daniel noticed that the board seemed to lean in her favor. Despite this, he held firm to his own vision. "I get where Grace is coming from," Daniel said, interrupting just as she reached a key point in her presentation. "But I believe we should be bolder with our expansion. We need to make it clear to the Millet that we're stepping into a new era." Grace looked at him, a blend of surprise and disappointment in her expression. She knew he was making a statement, but this was not the time for personal ambition. Keeping her voice steady, she replied, "Daniel, you remember that this aggressive approach has led us into trouble before. Our focus now is restructuring, putting our mission above rapid growth." The board watched the back and forth with interest, visibly divided, but Daniel, unwilling to concede, pressed on. "Grace, I understand your caution, but without taking risks, we'll settle into mediocrity that will eventually drag us down. The company needs to stand out and show results." Grace kept her calm, shaking her head. "The company needs stability, Daniel. The communities we're working with rely on a sustainable approach. We're beyond the point where we act based on the personal agendas of our leaders." The tension was thick in the room. Some members of the board exchanged approving looks with Grace, while others seemed open to Daniel's arguments. Mr. Lindsay, the board president, finally intervened, asking both to bring a unified proposal to the next meeting. Grace nodded, her expression composed, but Daniel felt a twinge of defeat. He realized he was losing his grip on the company he had once built. That evening, He stayed late at the office, poring over financial statements, trying to reframe his proposal in a way that would make it more appealing. His mind buzzed with ideas, but each one seemed to risk the project's integrity. Then, a message popped up from an old acquaintance, a businessman offering a substantial investment in exchange for a minor role in shaping the company's community projects. To Daniel, it looked like the perfect solution. He'd secure the needed funds and prove to Grace that he too could act in the company's best interest. Without consulting Grace or the board, he arranged a meeting with the potential investor. The following day, he laid out his ambitious growth plans, and within just a few hours, he sealed an initial deal. Daniel felt victorious. Finally, something tangible to showcase his leadership potential. But Grace's reaction was anything but supportive. As soon as she found out about the deal, she headed straight to Daniel's office. He was on a video call with the new investor, animatedly discussing expansion ideas. When he saw Grace walk in, his stomach twisted uncomfortably. She looked furious, and he knew he was in for it. When the call ended, Grace folded her arms, fixing him with a glare that made his pulse race. "You made a deal without the board's approval. How could you?" Daniel took a steadying breath, ready to explain his side. "Grace, this was an opportunity. We need this funding to grow. I'm trying to protect the company, just like you." She shook her head, clearly frustrated. "Protect the company? Do you even realize the risk you've taken? This investor now has influence over our community projects. What happens when he starts steering them in his own direction?" Daniel tried to keep his composure. "It's a manageable risk, Grace. He only has a minor stake. Nothing more." Her eyes narrowed. "And what about our commitment to putting people first, to being transparent? This isn't the kind of leadership we agreed to pursue." Her words struck him like a blow, leaving him feeling exposed, vulnerable, and resentful of Grace's constant disapproval. "Why do you always expect me to mess up? I'm doing my best, Grace. I want to do the right thing." Grace took a deep breath, her gaze softening slightly, but her voice stayed firm. "It's not about hoping you fail, Daniel. It's about you understanding the consequences of your actions. Leadership isn't only about big moves. It's about accountability. Acting behind the scenes just shows that you still don't get that." Daniel looked away, feeling the weight of her words sink in. Maybe I'll never understand it the way you need me to, Grace." She nodded, as if she'd already prepared herself for that answer. "Maybe. And until you do," she replied, "you'll just keep breaking those same promises. Believe me, that's a weight no one can bear forever." 2 weeks later, the board convened to review a deal Daniel had pushed through without their approval. Concerns about the deal's potential impact were heavy in the air. When the meeting began, Grace wasted no time voicing her objections. "This contract Michael's a departure from the values we've worked hard to uphold. We now have an outside investor with influence over our social initiatives, and I trust everyone here understands the risks involved." Mr. Lindsay, listening intently to Grace, turned to Daniel. "Can you explain the reasoning behind this choice?" Daniel felt a lump in his throat, but tried to keep his cool. "I believe this investment could offer the financial stability we need to expand and ensure the project's long-term sustainability." The board president interrupted with a hard tone. "Daniel, this isn't just about money. We have a mission here that can't be compromised. You acted rashly." Daniel felt the pressure rising. He glanced at Grace, whose face showed nothing but disappointment. It hit him. He hadn't just lost the board's confidence. He'd squandered his last chance to prove he could change. At the meeting's close, the board agreed to review Daniel's authority, possibly limiting his role in future decisions. He left the room in silence, defeated. In that moment, He recognized that if he was serious about changing, he'd have to set his pride aside. Grace wasn't just challenging his choices, she was offering him a new way to lead. And for the first time, Daniel began to see that the type of leadership he'd practiced had no place here anymore. Back home after the meeting, Daniel found himself on the brink of an emotional breakdown. His home, once a symbol of success, felt hollow and cold. He had invested years in building a solid career, crafting a powerful reputation, and now everything seemed to be slipping away. He understood it wasn't the board or Grace to blame. The fault lay with his own actions. Everything he and Grace had tried to build was now crumbling because of his impulsive, stubborn decisions. There was no more running from the truth. The same selfish impulses had always driven Daniel, who made snap decisions without taking anyone else into account. His behavior was isolating him not only from his team and the board, but most importantly, from Grace. Daniel arrived at the office early the following morning, weighed down by a profound sense of emptiness and regret. He knew he needed to understand the true motives behind his actions. He sat down in his office amid a mountain of reports and memos, facing his own reflection rather than Grace or the board. For the first time, he began to really question his choices. Grace's words from the recent meeting echoed in his mind. She had challenged his perspective, not just as a CEO, but as a person. "You're still treating this company like it's only about profit," she had said. Now, those words carried a new significance, pushing him to consider what genuine leadership might look like. As he surveyed the quiet office space, he realized his leadership style had likely missed the Michael. Maybe he had only been playing a part, the role of a ruthless, profit-driven businessman who believed numbers alone defined success. But now, as he grappled with the potential loss of his role and the trust of those he once led, he started to see that leadership had to transcend the numbers on a balance sheet. That afternoon, Grace appeared at his door. Her expression was firm, but there was a softened edge he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps she was seeing a different side of him. Exhausted by all the conflicts, Daniel chose honesty. "Grace," he began, his voice unsteady, "I know I've made some serious mistakes. I realize now how my choices have hurt others, maybe in ways I can't fully repair. And I get it, if you think it's too late for me to try." Grace stood in silence, arms crossed, watching him, but there was something in her stance, a willingness to listen. "It's a start, Daniel," she replied, her tone softer than before. "But admitting mistakes isn't enough. What are you planning to do about it?" Daniel took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the weight of her question. He'd considered it, but he didn't yet have all the answers. "I don't know, Grace," he admitted, "but I can't keep going down the same path." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's right. Real change is something you have to work on every single day. Learning to listen and understand that leadership isn't about always holding the reins. It's about serving others. Can you still commit to that?" Daniel gulped. "Yes, I'm willing, but I don't know if I can manage it by myself." Grace offered a slight smile, as if she saw a glimpse of possibility. "No one can, Daniel," she replied. "That's why real leadership thrives on partnership. You have to be able to rely on others. You need to understand you can't carry it all solo." Her words reverberated in his mind. Daniel realized he had spent years attempting to control every detail, believing that trusting others would only weaken him. But now, facing his own limitations, he began to wonder if perhaps trust was the missing piece in his leadership approach. After a quiet moment, Grace continued, "If you genuinely want to transform, there's a path forward, but it won't be easy. It's going to require you to let go of everything you think you know about leadership." Daniel looked up, sensing a real glimmer of hope. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes, show me how I can make a difference." Later that week, Grace took Daniel to his first outreach project under the company's new community initiative. The program was focused on helping women in tough situations build skills and find work. For Daniel, accustomed to the comfort and formality of the corporate world, the grassroots setting felt starkly different. During one session with the women involved, he found himself surrounded by people he never imagined he'd sit beside. Single mothers, survivors of abusive relationships, and others striving to keep their families afloat. As he listened to each story, Daniel felt the weight of every word. This wasn't about revenue or spreadsheets. It was about people, about lives where every dollar and each opportunity mattered. As the session wrapped up, an elderly woman approached him. "You're Mr. Daniel Carter, right? The one whose company is funding this program?" she asked, her voice steady. Daniel, feeling a bit uneasy, nodded. "Yes, that's me." She looked at him for a lingering moment. "My son worked for your company years ago. He was let go without notice after years of loyalty. It crushed him. He lost his drive, you know." Daniel felt a pang in his chest, a mix of regret and shame. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head slowly. "Maybe you never took the time to understand. But seeing you here today, I think something might be different." "I hope this change is real," she added, leaving Daniel feeling vulnerable and exposed. Her words struck him as an undeniable truth, one that made him confront his past actions. For years, he'd caused pain without ever realizing it. He was exactly the type of businessman Grace had described, someone blind to the true worth of people. Back at the office, still processing what he'd experienced, Daniel sought out Grace and thanked her for bringing him to the project. "I really get it now, Grace," he said, with genuine appreciation. Grace looked at him, her gaze softened with understanding rather than her usual coolness. "This is just the beginning, Daniel. Change requires time and effort. But as you keep at it, you'll start to realize that true leadership is about serving others." That same week, Grace encouraged him to attend a meeting with the team working on the project. It was a chance for him to hear out their concerns and ideas, something he'd rarely taken time for before. Walking into the room, Daniel felt the weight of their eyes on him. Some looked wary, others hopeful. He knew he had to earn their trust back, and fast. Grace nudged him to say something, but he paused, realizing that listening might be the best first step. The meeting started with each team member sharing their thoughts on the project's direction. Michael, an idealistic and committed young team member, spoke up about the struggles they faced due to limited resources and the demand for quick results. "We need steadiness, Daniel," Michael said, his tone respectful but resolute. "This project isn't some short-term investment. The people we're helping depend on us, and that takes patience and dedication." Daniel listened intently, feeling the weight of his past decisions. He understood that Michael, like Grace, cared deeply about the project's success, but wanted it built on a foundation of long-term support. For the first time, Daniel found himself wanting to understand their perspectives rather than pushing his own. After the meeting, he resolved to become more involved in the project, not as a leader, but as someone willing to learn. He wanted to see the real-world impact of his decisions. Grace joined him on visits to some of the communities they supported. During one visit, he met Julia, a young mother who'd found new hope through a training program that allowed her to secure a job and support her daughter. She spoke with heartfelt gratitude about how the project had transformed her life. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest as he listened, realizing that her story was a powerful reminder. He wasn't just managing numbers on a screen, but working with real lives, people who had stories, struggles, and hopes. This was more than just a project or another step on his career ladder. Seeing the meaningful change Grace had championed opened his eyes. He now understood that the true measure of success wasn't in statistics, but in the lives transformed by the project. Back at the office, he approached Grace with a new sense of gravity and resolve. "You were right, Grace. I treated this as a tool, something to polish my image and propel me forward. But today, I saw just how misguided I was." Grace watched him, taking in his words carefully. "So, what do you intend to do about it?" He paused, choosing his words with purpose. "I want to change. I want to do this the right way, to serve and witness the genuine impact of our work. I want everyone touched by this project to experience something I've never truly known, authentic leadership." Grace nodded, recognizing a spark of sincerity. "Then start proving it. In every decision, every interaction. Show us you're serious, not just in words, but in action." Over the following weeks, Daniel remained deeply engaged, actively participating in every initiative, shadowing team members, and learning from their hands-on efforts. Gradually, his role evolved. He was no longer the commanding figure issuing directives. Instead, he became someone open to listening, understanding, and serving. The board, initially skeptical, began to notice these subtle changes in his demeanor. He was more open to feedback and less quick to react. Grace also noticed his growth, though she stayed cautiously observant, aware that real change took time and perseverance. By the month's end, Daniel sensed a newfound peace in his work. For the first time, he viewed the project not as a means to an end for his own advancement, but as a mission with a purpose that impacted countless lives. When Grace happened to walk by his office, he stood up and offered his gratitude. "Thank you, Grace, for not giving up on me, even when it seemed like I'd never get it." She gave a slight smile. "Leadership is a journey, Daniel. But if you're committed, I believe you'll find what it's truly about." With this fresh outlook, Daniel felt truly prepared for a path of meaningful and impactful leadership. He threw himself into the project with a dedication that astonished those around him. In the weeks after the crisis, he made it his mission to master every aspect of the work, from weekly community check-ins to scrutinizing financial reports down to the last detail. Rather than treating the project as just another investment, Daniel began to see it as a purpose-driven mission. This was his chance to rebuild not only the confidence of the board and his team, but also his own sense of integrity. Board members started to notice this change. Grace was one of the first to recognize how invested Daniel had become. Initially, she observed from a distance, wondering if his new approach would hold. But as time passed, Daniel's unwavering presence, his genuine questions, and his willingness to listen and learn demonstrated his deep commitment. As his resolve became clear, the board's respect and confidence in him grew as well. At first, Daniel attended project meetings out of obligation, but before long, these gatherings became a core part of his schedule. He began learning people's names, understanding their struggles, and celebrating their achievements. It was a stark shift from the luxurious offices and high-profile meetings that once filled his days. During one visit, he had a heartfelt conversation with Ashley, a middle-aged woman who had recently lost her job and found a new beginning within the project. Ashley shared with raw honesty the challenges she'd faced and how the initiative helped her reclaim her dignity. "It's more than a job for me, Mr. Daniel," Ashley said, her eyes brimming with emotion. "It's a new life. For the first time, I feel like someone believes in my potential." Daniel felt a tightness in his throat. He wasn't simply aiding one individual, he was transforming lives. Each story he heard was a powerful reminder of the difference he could make, fueling his commitment even further. He wanted to live up to the trust these people had in the project, and more importantly, prove that he genuinely cared. The project was no longer just a plan on paper. It had become real. The positive outcomes started to emerge, and with them, the company's reputation soared. The board members, who once questioned Daniel's capacity to lead effectively, now appeared to express approval. In meetings, Daniel kept his demeanor calm and direct, steering clear of the flamboyant style that used to define him. He shared the project results with a grounded approach, giving credit to the team and emphasizing Grace's critical contributions. Each statistic served as undeniable evidence that the project was creating real impact, and the board members didn't mask their satisfaction. Mr. Lindsay, the board's chairman, remicled during one of the meetings, "Daniel, I see you're approaching this project with a level of seriousness many of us hadn't anticipated. This pilot program is a triumph, and I believe we can expand it in a way that's sustainable." Daniel allowed himself a quiet smile, feeling the weight of their approval. He was fully aware that Grace had been an irreplaceable guide in this journey, and he never missed a chance to recognize her in each meeting. What had once been simple professional respect was beginning to evolve into something more personal. As they spent more time together, Daniel started seeing Grace in a new light. She wasn't just a remiclable leader. She was a courageous, sincere woman who was truly committed to her work. He noticed it in the way she spoke to every individual involved in the project, the care she took with each detail, and the respect she extended to all. Grace was a quiet force that naturally commanded trust and respect. Daniel and Grace went to a gathering that project participants organized one day while they were in the neighborhood. The locals had prepared a modest celebration to show their gratitude to the team. When they arrived, Daniel watched Grace interact with people, her kindness evident in a way that moved him profoundly. Everyone present responded warmly to the warmth she exuded, and she fit right in. She really gets these people, Daniel thought with admiration. Grace didn't merely oversee the project, she was fully immersed in it, and everyone felt that connection. When the celebration wrapped up, Daniel offered to walk Grace back to the office. As they strolled through the peaceful community streets, he felt a growing urge to understand her better. Grace was a bit of a mystery, and he wanted to uncover what drove her passion for their work. "Grace," he began in a gentler voice, "I've always been struck by your dedication to this project." "What made you get so deeply involved?" Daniel asked. Grace's face brightened with a sincere smile. "Daniel, I think I've always felt a calling to make a difference. When I was younger, I saw people close to me struggling, and it left a lasting impact on me. Helping others rebuild is, for me, the most fulfilling way to give my life purpose." Her words reached Daniel in an unexpected way. He'd never considered their work through that lens. To him, it was about reputation and legacy. But for Grace, it was deeply personal, a mission close to her heart. And from that moment, he began to see the depth behind the remiclable woman beside him. In the following weeks, Daniel and Grace grew even closer. What had once been a formal and guarded partnership turned relaxed, filled with mutual respect and admiration. They brainstormed strategies, swapped ideas, and stood by each other in every decision. Yet Daniel began to sense something different stirring within him. His feelings toward Grace were shifting from admiration to something far deeper. This realization took him by surprise. Daniel, who had always maintained a careful distance from romantic feelings in the workplace, now found himself thinking about Grace constantly, eager to be near her and see her smile. She brought a calm but energizing presence, someone who motivated him to grow and to press forward. One evening, after a long meeting, they lingered in the office, talking about the future of the project. What started as a professional discussion turned personal, and Daniel took the opportunity to share his gratitude. "Grace, "I owe you so much for what I've learned these past months," he said earnestly. "Before, I thought success was all about control and expansion. But you've shown me that the real value lies in creating something meaningful." Grace turned to face him, clearly moved by his words. "It means so much to know that, Daniel. Seeing this growth in you has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. Daniel felt an impulse to move closer, but held back, aware of the professional boundary they shared. Yet, he knew that what he felt for Grace was genuine and real. As time went on, Daniel felt increasingly captivated by Grace. He began noticing all the small things, her smile when something touched her heart, the way she inspired those around her, and the dedication she had for their project. Grace was different, someone who added a layer of meaning to his life that he hadn't known before. One evening, after hours at the office while they were going over some final reports, Daniel, almost without realizing it, blurted out, "You know, you're one of the most incredible people I've ever met, right?" The sincerity in his voice clearly surprised Grace, who gave a soft laugh. "Thank you, Daniel," she replied, "but I think you've changed too, and you've become someone worth admiring." Her words echoed in his heart, and he realized he was genuinely in love. This wasn't just another passing attraction. It was a deep respect and a shared vision with Grace, a desire to build something meaningful alongside her. As he walked home that night, Daniel felt a profound shift. Grace had not only changed his work life, but had touched his heart in a way that made everything feel different. From that moment, he knew that regardless of what lay ahead, his life was forever altered. The days went by, and Daniel and Grace grew closer. Their professional partnership began evolving into a deeper connection, a closeness that grew with every encounter. Daniel, once driven purely by ambition, now felt himself opening up to moments of honesty and vulnerability with Grace. He felt lighter, more alive, and for the first time, truly whole. Grace, too, saw these changes in Daniel. Spending time with him, she noticed how much he'd grown into someone genuinely admirable. His transformation wasn't a show, it was real, and that drew her to him in a way she hadn't expected. She admired his commitment to creating something significant, and slowly, her heart began to open to him as well. In the weeks that followed, Daniel looked for little opportunities to be close to Grace. He'd invite her for lunch after meetings. Daniel felt a rush of tenderness and longing he couldn't ignore. The gentle warmth between them was almost palpable, and he found himself stealing glances at Grace, each one pulling him deeper into his feelings. Breaking the quiet that had settled over them, he cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice low and sincere. They sat side by side, close enough that their arms brushed against each other, and Daniel felt a rush of tenderness and longing he couldn't ignore. The gentle warmth between them was almost palpable, and he found himself stealing glances at Grace, each one pulling him deeper into his feelings. Breaking the quiet that had settled over them, he cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice low and sincere. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, surprising even himself with the weight of his words. "For everything. For teaching me, for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself, even when I didn't deserve it." Grace looked at him, her expression softening as she listened to the gratitude in his voice. For a moment, she seemed taken aback, as if she hadn't realized how much she'd truly impacted him, but then her face relaxed into a gentle smile. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel," she replied, her tone calm and understanding. "The change came from you. I just helped you find your own way." Daniel smiled back, but there was more he had to say, something he could no longer keep bottled up. His heart was pounding, each beat urging him forward, giving him the courage to finally express what he'd been holding on to for so long. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. "Grace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his words laced with vulnerability. "I can't keep hiding how I feel. The truth is, I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with emotion, and for a few seconds, time seemed to stand still as Grace processed what he'd just said. Daniel's heart raced, his mind filled with a mix of hope and fear, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake by speaking his truth. But instead of withdrawing, Grace's face softened even more, her eyes shining with a warmth that gave him all the reassurance he needed. "I'm in love with you too, Daniel," she confessed, her voice full of a quiet, unwavering honesty. "I've been feeling this way for a while now, but I was afraid of what it might mean for us, for everything we've built together." A relieved, emotional laugh escaped from Daniel, breaking the tension that had gripped him. "I've felt the same way," he admitted, his voice tinged with relief. "But I can't pretend anymore. I don't just want us to be colleagues or friends. I want something real with you, something more." Grace's eyes met his, and she gave a small nod, her smile full of hope and understanding. "I want that too," she whispered, her words barely audible. "I think we're finally ready for this. For something that's truly ours." They sat there, caught in each other's gaze, leaning in as they closed the small distance between them. Daniel's heart nearly stopped as their lips met in a soft, lingering kiss, full of the emotion they had both kept hidden. In that instant, every wall they'd built, every doubt, every fear, melted away, leaving only the raw, undeniable connection they shared. After the kiss, they pulled back slightly, exchanging a look that said everything words couldn't. Daniel wrapped his arms around her in a tender embrace, a silent promise of what lay ahead for them. From that day forward, their relationship blossomed naturally, each moment bringing them closer together. They spent time outside of work, exploring the city, sharing dinners, and enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. Every shared experience deepened their bond, allowing them to see new sides of each other that made their connection even stronger. At work, they remained professional and focused, though anyone observing them could sense a new light in their eyes, a bond that had grown undeniable. Together, Grace and Daniel made it clear that their commitment to the project would never waver, despite the love they had found in one another. The bond between them was undeniable, and it fueled their shared dedication to making the project succeed. Over the months, they watched as their hard work transformed the community. The project achieved remarkable success, opening doors for people who once struggled to find employment or personal growth. What had once seemed impossible was now a reality for many. As the project expanded into neighboring areas, the company's reputation grew. It became known for its positive, sustainable impact, and the board finally recognized the value Daniel brought to the table. They fully reinstated him in his leadership role, a decision even Mr. Lindsay, one of his toughest critics, openly supported. In a meeting, Mr. Lindsay commended Daniel, a rare act for him. "Daniel, you've proven that change is possible. This project's success is a testament to your commitment and vision. I'm proud to say you've truly become a leader." Daniel accepted the praise humbly, reflecting on how long and challenging the journey had been. He glanced at Grace, who sat beside him, and his heart swelled with gratitude. He knew she had been his anchor through it all, a constant source of strength that made every hardship bearable. Their relationship outside of work continued to deepen. They were truly happy together, and Daniel realized he wanted to build a future with Grace,